welcome back to Oliver's Stories. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the greatest conqueror the ancient world ever saw. A man who tamed the wild horse Bucephalus as a boy and wept for new worlds to conquer as a man. His name was Alexander of Macedon, and his story is one of glory, madness, and an unquenchable hunger for more. The boy's official birthday is the 3rd of July, 356 BCE. Macedon is still considered a bit of a backwater by the polished Greeks in Athens, but under King Philip II, it is rapidly becoming a military powerhouse. His father, Philip, is busy turning ragged militias into disciplined battalions and welding scattered tribes into one unified state. His mother, Olympias, is no ordinary queen. She is fiercely religious, sharp-tongued, and prone to fiery moods. Some ancient sources claim she practiced strange snake-handling rituals. Imagine bedtime stories that included not just fairy tales but serpents slithering across the floorboards. Whether or not the snakes were real, Olympias certainly filled her son's ears with the idea that he was no ordinary mortal. She insisted he carried divine blood, descended through her line from Achilles himself. Imagine being tucked in with that story. Sweet dreams, dear. You are the heir of a demigod, so do not disappoint us. His birth was wrapped in omens, at least according to later storytellers. They said that the same night Alexander was born, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned down. To people of the time, this was not a coincidence but a cosmic shift. One marvel falls so that another, in human form, can rise. Historians still argue whether this tale was genuine folklore or later propaganda to paint his life as destined. Either way, it set the tone. From his very first breaths, Alexander's life was treated as something out of myth. Life in the palace at Pella was less glamorous than you might imagine. The Macedonian court was not dripping in gold like Persia. It was rough, earthy, and loud. Soldiers with mud on their boots tramped across mosaic floors. Merchants bickered in the courtyards, and banquets smelled of roasted goat and onions. For a child, it was a mix of privilege and chaos. He had tutors, servants, and fine clothes, but he also overheard drunken generals swearing allegiance one night and plotting betrayal the next. Alexander. His earliest education was not just in scrolls and lyres. It was in watching the shifting faces of power, learning to listen between the lines of conversation. By the time he was 10, he had the eyes of a hawk for spotting lies. But Alexander was still a child. He squabbled with other boys, adored his hound peritas, and loved athletic games. Macedonian boys were taught early that strength and courage mattered. Hunting trips into the forests trained his reflexes. Riding taught him balance and boldness. Imagine a gangly boy barely tall enough to mount his pony, gripping the reins while stable hands laughed, determined not to tumble into the dust. He learned to hurl spears at moving targets, chase wild boar through tangled brush, and ride until his thighs burned. For him, these were not chores. They were rehearsals for the role his parents kept telling him he was born to play. One famous childhood story cemented his legend, the taming of Bucephalus. A powerful black horse was brought to court, but it thrashed and reared, throwing every rider. Philip declared it useless. Alexander, however, noticed something. The stallion was frightened by its own shadow. Turning the horse toward the sun, he calmed it, spoke gently, and then vaulted onto its back. Before long he was galloping across the plain. The crowd gasped. Philip supposedly muttered, "My boy, you must find a kingdom large enough for your ambition. Macedon is too small for you." Was this story polished by court propagandists later? Almost certainly. But the symbolism mattered. The boy who could tame the untamable beast was also the one who could tame chaos itself. Historians still debate whether Bucephalus really was so wild or if the tale was exaggerated. But what is undeniable is that Bucephalus remained Alexander's companion into adulthood, carrying him through battles all the way to India. You could say this was less a story about a horse and more a parable about destiny. If Alexander could master one wild creature, he could master the world. His formal education soon expanded. At first, local tutors taught him reading, music, and the basics of Homer. But his father wanted the best, and eventually brought in the philosopher Aristotle. Imagine being a teenager and having one of history's greatest thinkers as your personal tutor. That, however, belongs more to the next stage of his life. In his earliest year, Ears Alexander's mind was already a cocktail of myth, ambition, and sharp observation. Olympias whispered that he was the new Achilles. Philip hammered into him the reality that power is seized, not gifted. The boy walked through palace halls where one day smelled of roasted lamb and laughter, the next of spilled wine and blood. Let us pause on the family dynamics because they mattered. Olympias and Philip did not exactly have a peaceful marriage. He was often away conquering neighbors and frequently took new wives or concubines. Olympias simmered with resentment, and Alexander often found himself caught between his father's booming authority and his mother's stinging intensity. It is said that Olympias cultivated in him a sense of loyalty to her alone, reminding him that Philip's throne might be his, but his true destiny was greater than Macedon. That kind of parental pressure could turn any child neurotic, but in Alexander's case, it forged ambition like iron in a furnace. A quirky tidbit. Ancient gossip claimed that Olympias once told Alexander that Zeus himself had visited her in the form of lightning, and that the boy was born from a union with the king of gods. Whether Alexander believed it fully or not, it stuck in his mind. Later in life, he demanded recognition as divine. Perhaps he was just playing the political game, but perhaps it was seeded in those childhood whispers from his mother. By the time Alexander was approaching adolescence, he was already developing a personality that frightened and fascinated those around him. He had a temper quick to flare if insulted, but also deep charisma. Friends said he had a piercing gaze that made you feel as though he saw right through you. He idolized Homer's Iliad, keeping a copy by his side. Achilles was not just his hero. Achilles was his model. He wanted to live a short, glorious life, rather than a long, obscure one. That is a dramatic teenage philosophy, but in his case, he lived it out. Picture him at 12 or 13 in the training yard at Pella. Dust rising, wooden spears clashing, other boys panting from exertion. Alexander pushes harder, refusing to give up, even if it means scraped knees and bruises. He is not the largest or strongest, but he is relentless, demanding from himself the kind of excellence his parents demanded of him. When he loses, he sulks, but he studies his mistakes. When he wins, he expects it, because in his mind, victory is his birthright. The palace environment added layers. Macedon was not like polished Athens. It was half-court, half-military camp. Banquets were loud affairs with kithara music, roasted meat and gallons of wine. Generals argued loudly over strategy. Servants darted in with platters. Dogs fought over scraps under the table. Young Alexander watched, absorbing lessons about command, loyalty, and betrayal. He understood early that men's tongues loosened with drink, and that kingship was not just glory but also suspicion, intrigue, and constant vigilance. And through it all, he remained aware of how others saw him. Some envied him as Philip's heir. Others doubted his legitimacy. Olympias, being from Epirus, was a foreigner in some eyes, and that taint fell upon her son. Alexander carried himself with a chip on his shoulder, determined to prove not just that he belonged, but that he was destined for something far greater than anyone else in the room. So by the time the boy was ready for formal philosophical training, he already stood out. He was restless, ambitious, and steeped in both myth and reality. He had learned to ride like, to be a warrior, to hunt like a prince, and to glare down servants who mocked him. He had mastered a horse others feared, and he had started to believe, half through his mother's urgings, half through his own pride, that he really was a descendant of gods. Historians still debate just how much of his later greatness was foreshadowed in these years. Some argue he was born with extraordinary charisma and leadership. Others insist he was simply molded by his parents' ambitions and Philip's military machine. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but what is certain is that by the time Alexander turned 13, he was not just a boy in a palace, he was a storm forming on the horizon. The child of Macedon was ready to step into the next stage of life, one that would bring him under the guidance of a philosopher whose ideas would echo in his head even as he charged into battlefields. But for now, the boy still lingers in the shadow of Pella, clutching his beloved copy of Homer, dreaming of Achilles, and whispering to Bucephalus that one day the world will know his name. Lessons from Aristotle. The boy who once wrestled with ponies and tamed Bucephalus was now stepping into adolescence, and Philip II decided his heir needed more than just spear drills and hunting trips. He needed a mind sharpened like a sword. And for that he summoned Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, to become Alexander's tutor. Imagine the teenage prince, dirt still on his sandals from chasing hounds through the Macedonian countryside, suddenly being told, "Pack up, kid. You are going to school with one of the sharpest brains in human history." That is like trading your local math teacher for Albert Einstein, except with a beard, a scroll library, and the ability to turn any question into a 10-hour lecture. Philip set up the royal school at Mieza, a secluded sanctuary in the Macedonian countryside, shaded by vineyards and dotted with shrines. Here, Alexander joined other noble boys, future generals and companions, under Aristotle's instruction. The environment itself felt like something out of a painting. Olive trees rustling in the breeze, the air heavy with thyme and resin, young men sprawled on stone benches while a philosopher gestured with a stylus. It was less Hogwarts and more Socratic boot camp, but still the atmosphere was transformative. Alexander did no number to sit politely and take notes. He was restless, energetic, and often challenged his teacher. Aristotle taught logic, ethics, medicine, natural sciences, and most importantly, philosophy. He introduced Alexander to Homer not just as poetry but as a manual for living. Alexander, already obsessed with Achilles, copied lines, memorized verses, and carried a dagger and annotated copy of the Iliad everywhere he went. It was the ancient equivalent of carrying your favorite book under your pillow, except your book told you how to slaughter Trojans and win eternal glory. One mainstream historical fact is that Aristotle taught Alexander not only literature and philosophy, but also biology and medicine. It is recorded that Alexander showed unusual interest in healing, later personally prescribing remedies to wounded soldiers on campaign. Imagine the scene: a future conqueror who could also mix herbs and diagnose fevers. You would not exactly expect your battlefield commander to say, "Hold on, let me check your pulse." Yet Alexander did just that, a direct echo of his schooling at Mieza. A quirky tidbit: Aristotle supposedly lectured with a pet hermit crab nearby. Strange, but true. The philosopher, had an obsession with cataloging animals. He dissected fish, studied bees, and classified shells. Some accounts suggest he showed his students everything from cuttlefish to chameleons. Picture Alexander, destined to storm Persian palaces, crouching to examine a crab scuttling across Aristotle's table. That was the odd mix of grandeur and geekiness that colored his youth. Historians still argue whether Alexander's later attempts to blend cultures, marrying Persian customs with Macedonian ones, came from Aristotle's teachings or from his own instincts. Aristotle emphasized Greek superiority, but also taught about the wider natural world. Some scholars claim Aristotle planted seeds of curiosity, encouraging Alexander to look beyond borders. Others argue Alexander later rebelled against Aristotle's prejudices. Either way, the influence of his tutor never entirely left him. In the schoolyard, Alexander was not alone. Other boys studied with him. Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, all names that would later resurface as generals, kings, and power brokers in the empire. The bonds forged at Mieza were more than just friendships. They were lifelines. These boys hunted together, debated fiercely, and ate from the same bowls. Imagine a group of teenagers joking, sparring, and occasionally pranking one another, except this group would later carve up the known world. Alexander himself grew especially close to Hephaestion, who became his lifelong companion and perhaps his truest friend. If Alexander was Achilles, Hephaestion was his Patroclus. The lessons were not all dry lectures. Aristotle made them practice rhetoric, stand and deliver a persuasive speech. Alexander loved this. He already had a voice that carried and a charisma that pulled eyes toward him. He practiced convincing others, a skill he would later wield not just in front of soldiers but in front of kings, queens, and whole cities. Aristotle also drilled into them the importance of observation. Do not just accept what you are told. Test it. If a stream looks shallow, wade in and check the depth yourself. That blend of skepticism and curiosity became part of Alexander's leadership. But there was also tension. Aristotle's philosophy carried the typical Greek disdain for barbarians. Greeks saw themselves as superior while others were lesser. Alexander, however, would later defy this by marrying foreign women, adopting Persian dress, and encouraging his soldiers to do the same. Historians debate whether this was a rejection of Aristotle's prejudice or simply political pragmatism. Still, the irony stands. The boy tutored in Greek supremacy would later attempt one of history's first experiments in multiculturalism. Daily life at Mieza had a rhythm. Mornings began with recitations, afternoons with debate, evenings with walks in the gardens where philosophy spilled into casual conversation. Imagine twilight settling in, cicadas buzzing, while Aristotle asked his pupils whether virtue was innate or learned. Alexander, never one to sit quietly, interrupted. What good is virtue if it does not win glory? That was the boy's mind at work, always pulling grand ideas back into the arena of ambition. Yet even as Aristotle lectured on moderation, Alexander absorbed lessons selectively. Aristotle praised balance in life, the golden mean. Alexander preferred extremes. Why walk the middle road when you can sprint to the ends of the earth? It was as though he heard all things in moderation and replied, "Sure, but only after I conquer Asia." One night, after lessons, Alexander and his companions may have lounged under the stars. With wine cups in hand, they might have pointed to constellations, reciting stories from Homer. In those moments, the line between myth and reality blurred. Alexander did not just want to read about Achilles, he wanted to be Achilles. When he looked at Orion's belt, he saw not distant stars but a path laid out for his own destiny. That was the dangerous thing about mixing philosophy and poetry. It could convince a boy that the universe itself was his stage. The prince's personality hardened during these years. He grew increasingly confident, sometimes arrogant in debates. He could slice through an argument with a sharp remark, but he also listened when it mattered. Friends respected him. Some feared him. All knew he was different. Aristotle's stamp on him was clear. Alexander could quote philosophy one moment and argue tactics the next. He was being sculpted into something rare, both thinker and warrior. Imagine the atmosphere. Oil lamps flickering, scrolls rolled across benches, the smell of parchment and ink, Aristotle tracing diagrams of the natural world, Alexander fidgeting, impatient to apply knowledge into action. The boy absorbed ideas like a sponge, but always tested them against his own burning ambition. Philosophy was fuel, but conquest remained the fire. What is striking is how much this period reveals about the dual nature of Alexander, the dreamer who memorized Homer and the pragmatist who studied medicine, the philosopher's pupil who loved reason and the warrior who believed destiny trumped moderation. He was shaped in equal measure by Aristotle's words and by his own restless hunger for greatness. By the time Alexander left Mieza, he was no longer just a boy. He was a young man armed with knowledge, friendship, and a sense of destiny sharpened by philosophy. He had learned how to argue, how to observe, how to persuade, and how to imagine a world beyond Macedon's borders. He was ready, when the time came, to put all of it into action. The lessons of Aristotle lingered, sometimes as guidance, sometimes as something to rebel against, but always as a voice in his head. And as Alexander stepped back into the wider world, with Bucephalus pawing the earth at his side, he carried more than a spear. He carried a mind sharpened by one of history's greatest teachers. The restless storm of boyhood had matured into a young man convinced that the world was waiting for him. And the world, though it did not yet realize it, was about to be proven right. First taste of battle. The boy who once listened to Aristotle's patient lessons under the vineyards of Mieza was now a teenager. Restless with energy, his mind sharp and his arms strong. Knowledge was useful, but Alexander was no bookworm. He wanted to prove himself in the way that truly mattered in Macedon, on the battlefield. And as luck or destiny would have it, war was always near when Philip II was your father. The year is 338 BCE. Philip is facing a coalition of Greek city-states who have had enough of Macedonian muscle. Athens and Thebes, two of the proudest polis, have rallied together against him. The decisive clash will come at a place called Chaeronea in Boeotia. For Alexander, now about 18, this is no classroom exercise. This is the real thing. Shields, spears, and the risk of being trampled into dust beneath the feet of charging hoplites. Imagine the weight of that moment. You have been told your whole life that you are destined for greatness, and now you get your chance to prove it. With thousands of men water. Ching talk about pressure. The Macedonian army is a terrifying machine by this point. Philip has transformed it into a disciplined phalanx, long spears bristling like porcupine quills, soldiers drilled to move as one. Alexander rides among them not as a pampered prince but as a cavalry commander. His unit, the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen of Macedon. Think of them as a blend between a tank division and a biker gang, except with more plumes and shouting. The battlefield at Chaeronea is dusty, sun glaring, the shouts of men echoing off the hills. You can almost feel the heat radiating off bronze helmets. Philip takes command of the Macedonian right while Alexander, still a teenager, leads the left wing. That is like letting your high school senior drive in the Indy 500. Was it risky? Absolutely. But Philip had faith, or at least a sense of theatrical timing. And Alexander, burning with youthful confidence, was ready to prove himself. When the clash begins, it is chaos. Shields slam, spears jab, horses rear, dust chokes the air. On the Theban side stands the sacred band, an elite unit of 300 men, sworn lovers fighting shoulder to shoulder, feared across Greece. Facing them would be intimidating for seasoned veterans, let alone a teenager. Yet Alexander does not falter. At a critical moment, he drives his cavalry straight into their flank, breaking their line. It is a daring move, executed with precision, and it shatters the enemy's resistance. The sacred band is annihilated, their reputation broken. The young prince has just announced himself to the world. Most historical accounts agree that Alexander's decisive cavalry charge at Chaeronea helped win the battle and secure Macedon's dominance over Greece. It was his first true military command, and he passed with flying colors. From that day forward, soldiers saw not just a prince but a leader capable of sharing their risks. A quirky tidbit. Some later stories claim that Alexander went into the battle with his copy of Homer tucked inside his armor, because what better motivation to fight than a bit of poetry pressed against your ribs? Scholars doubt the literal truth of this, but it fits his personality perfectly, never separating action from myth. If you are going to stab your way into history, you might as well have Achilles whispering in your ear. Historians still argue whether Philip deliberately left the glory moment to his son, or whether Alexander truly outshone his father by his own brilliance. Some say Philip orchestrated the whole maneuver, letting Alexander take credit for morale's sake. Others insist Alexander showed genuine tactical genius even then. The debate captures the tension between father and son. Was Alexander already outgrowing Philip's shadow, or was Philip setting the stage for him? Either way, the boy returned from Chaeronea with blood on his spear and honor in his name. For Alexander, the battle was not just about killing enemies, it was about proving loyalty to his men. He fought in the thick of it, charging where the risk was highest, making sure no one could accuse him of being a pampered princeling who stayed behind the lines. Soldiers noticed things like that. They saw him dusty, sweaty, shouting commands, risking his life. And in the language of war, that spoke louder than any speech. The victory at Chaeronea had seismic consequences. The Greek city-states were crushed, their independence effectively ended. Philip formed the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states under Macedonian hegemony. For the first time, a united, Greek world was at least theoretically possible. And though Philip was the architect, Alexander was the poster child, the youthful heir who had proved himself in blood. But not everything was triumph. The victory meant grief for the Greeks, and some remembered Alexander not as a noble youth, but as the boy who helped destroy their freedom. Perspective matters. To Macedonians, he was a rising star. To many Greeks, he was the face of conquest. Imagine being 18 and already a symbol of both glory and resentment. No pressure, right? Back at Pella, Alexander basked in the glow of military fame. But his relationship with his father grew more complicated. Philip was still the king, still the strategist, still the one with power. Yet now Alexander had tasted battle and glory, and his ambition flared. For Olympias, it was proof that her son was destined to eclipse Philip. For Philip, it was a reminder that his son's fire might one day burn him too. Family dinners probably were not the most relaxed. One can picture the scene. Philip raising a cup at a banquet, boasting of Macedon's might. Alexander smirking just slightly, as if to say, "Yes, father," but who led the charge that broke the sacred band? Pride and rivalry mixed uneasily in the air. Macedon's court was never without tension, and now that tension had sharpened, Still, for Alexander personally, Chaeronea was transformative. He had gone from student to soldier, from boy to commander. He had felt the thud of hooves, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the rush of adrenaline as enemies scattered before him. No lesson in Aristotle's school could have given him that. He had lived the epic he admired. He was no longer just reading Achilles. He was becoming Achilles. And deep down, Alexander must have realized something. Once you have tasted that kind of glory, nothing else compares. Hunting trips, palace banquets, even philosophical debates, all of them felt tame compared to the pulse of battle. It was addictive, it was dangerous, and it would shape every decision he made from then on. The world might still see him as a prince, but inside, he already felt like a conqueror, and the path ahead, shadowed by his father's dominance, twisted with politics and fueled by ambition, was only getting more treacherous. For the storm was gathering, and at its center stood a young man who now knew exactly how it felt to hold destiny in his hands. Death of Philip, rise of Alexander. The dust of Chaeronea had hardly settled before tension at home coiled tighter. Alexander had proven himself in battle, but proving yourself on the field and surviving your father's court were two very different skills. Macedon's palace at Pella was a hive of ambition, and Philip II, brilliant, ruthless, and unpredictable, was still the king. Imagine the awkwardness. A teenager with battlefield glory under his belt, living under a father who both praised and feared being overshadowed. You could cut the atmosphere at royal banquets with a spear tip. Philip was riding higher than ever. His victory at Chaeronea had crowned him master of Greece. He now set his eyes eastward toward Persia, the greatest empire of the age. For decades, Greek city-states had dreamed of avenging the Persian invasions of 480 BCE, when Xerxes' armies stormed Greece, when Leonidas fell at Thermopylae, and when Athens burned. Philip planned to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade across the Aegean to liberate Greek cities under Persian rule and to seize Persian wealth for himself. He was the man with the vision, the army, and the plan. Alexander, meanwhile, was the impatient heir, waiting for his chance to breathe without his father's shadow blotting out the sun. But Philip's triumphs were always laced with drama. He was not a model family man. He had married multiple wives, partly for politics, partly for pleasure. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was proud and fiery, and she did not take kindly to being displaced or disrespected. At one infamous wedding feast, Philip married Cleopatra Eurydice, not the Egyptian queen you are thinking of, but a young Macedonian noblewoman. At the banquet, Cleopatra's uncle Attalus raised a toast, wishing for a legitimate Macedonian heir. That is, a son from a true Macedonian wife, not from Olympias, who was from Epirus. Imagine being Olympias in that moment. Imagine being Alexander, sitting there realizing that your legitimacy had just been insulted in front of the entire court. Alexander's temper, always quick to ignite, exploded. He hurled a cup at Attalus. Insults were shouted, weapons almost drawn. Philip, drunk and enraged, actually lunged at Alexander with a sword, only to trip and fall. The scene was equal parts tragic and ridiculous. The mighty king sprawled on the floor, his son spitting. With fury, the banquet erupting in chaos. Alexander is said to have sneered, "Here is the man who plans to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another without falling." Ouch! That is the kind of burn that gets remembered. After this quarrel, Alexander and Olympias left Macedon for a time, going into semi-exile in Epirus. It was not a permanent break. Philip could not discard his heir so easily, but it showed just how strained things had become in the royal family. A quirky tidbit. Some sources claim Olympias kept snakes in her bedchamber during this period, unnerving guests who discovered them slithering under blankets. Whether literal or symbolic, it paints a vivid picture. The Queen of Macedon, proud and vengeful, surrounded by serpents like a living oracle. One almost imagines Alexander as a boy learning to sleep soundly even with the occasional reptile brushing against his ankles. No wonder the man feared a little later in life. Historians still argue whether Philip truly intended to sideline Alexander in favor of Cleopatra Eurydice's potential children. Some say Philip remained pragmatic, knowing Alexander was already established as heir. Others believe Philip wanted a purer Macedonian dynasty. The debate underscores how fragile royal succession could be. Legitimacy was not just birthright. It was a weapon wielded and contested at every feast. The tension between father and son continued until fate intervened. In 336 BCE, Philip gathered Macedon's elite for a grand celebration at Aegae, modern-day Vergina. The occasion was the marriage of his daughter, Cleopatra, not to be confused with his new wife of the same name. Yes, confusing. Kings, generals and ambassadors thronged the theatre. Torches blazed, garlands hung, musicians played. Philip, flush with triumph, strode into the theatre in dazzling white robes, unarmed and proud. His guards were conspicuously absent, left behind to demonstrate trust in his people. It was a fatal mistake. Out of the crowd stepped Pausanias, one of Philip's own bodyguards, with a dagger concealed. He struck swiftly, plunging the blade into the king. Philip collapsed, blood staining his ceremonial robe. Gasps and screams rippled through the theatre. Pausanias fled, only to be cut down by pursuing guards. Just like that, the great king was dead. The assassination shocked everyone. Is it personal revenge? Pausanias had a long simmering grudge, supposedly humiliated by Attalus. Or was it a conspiracy? Some whispered that Olympias had a hand in it. She certainly had motive, simmering hatred and frankly a flair for dramatic vengeance. Others even pointed fingers at Alexander himself, though evidence is thin. Historians still argue fiercely. Was Philip felled by palace intrigue, by his wife's machinations, by his son's ambition, or simply by a guard's wounded pride? The truth is murky, lost in the swirl of gossip and propaganda. What mattered in that moment, though, was the aftermath. Philip was dead, and the throne stood vacant. Macedon could easily splinter in crisis. Armies without a leader, rivals eyeing power, foreign enemies circling. Into this void stepped Alexander, just 20 years old, his face set, his heart pounding. This was his moment, terrifying and thrilling all at once. He wasted no time. Moving with ruthless speed, he secured the loyalty of the army, the real power in Macedon. Soldiers had seen him fight at Chaeronea. They knew he could lead. He was proclaimed king. Rivals were eliminated with chilling efficiency. Any cousins or pretenders unlew. CKY enough to stand in his way were removed permanently. Alexander may have been young, but he was no naive boy. He knew that wearing the crown meant sleeping with daggers always near, and he acted accordingly. Olympias, of course, was delighted. Some say she went on a purge of her own, eliminating Cleopatra Eurydice and her child to secure her son's throne. The stories vary, but all agree that Macedon's palace in those days echoed with both coronation chants and screams behind closed doors. The transfer of power was not gentle, not elegant. It was brutal. That is monarchy for you. One day garlands, the next day daggers. Alexander took the throne amid both celebration and suspicion. He was now king of Macedon, hegemon of Greece, commander of a restless army, and inheritor of Philip's grand plan to invade Persia. He stood at the edge of greatness, but he also stood at the edge of danger. Many Greek cities thought Philip's death was their chance to break free. Rebels stirred in Thebes, Athens, and elsewhere. Foreign powers waited to see whether the boy king would falter. His throne was not yet secure. For Alexander, the moment was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had long Drea, med of glory, but now responsibility crashed down like a shield on his shoulders. He must prove not only that he could fight, but that he could rule. The crown weighed heavy, even on a head already swollen with ambition. Imagine him that night in his chambers. The torches burned low. Outside, soldiers chanted his name. Inside, he sat with Bucephalus tethered nearby, stroking the horse's mane, whispering perhaps to himself. His father's ghost still lingered, brilliant, flawed, murdered in his prime. Alexander must have felt both grief and relief, fear and fire. He knew what his mother had always told him. Destiny waited, but destiny did not come freely. He would have to seize it, hold it, and never let go. Thus, in the span of days, Alexander transformed again, from prince to heir to king. The boy who once squabbled in Aristotle's school now wore the diadem. The young cavalry commander at Chaeronea now commanded an empire in waiting. The son who once quarreled with his father now inherited his father's dream. The world was watching. Greece was restless. Persia was vast and rich. Alexander was 20 years old, and already the fuse of his legend was burning, crushing revolts in Greece. ECE. Alexander wore the crown now, But it did not sit quietly on his head. At just 20 years old, he was king of Macedon. But across Greece, city-states whispered, "Philip is dead. The boy cannot hold power. This is our chance." For them, the murder of Philip in 336 BCE was not just palace intrigue, it was opportunity. Old grudges resurfaced, rebellion simmered, and the Greek world waited to see whether Alexander was merely a child king ripe for toppling. Thebes, proud and warlike, was the first to stir. Athens hesitated, but many in the city remembered old glories and dreamed of breaking free from Macedonian dominance. Other smaller states tested their boundaries, refusing tribute and sharpening weapons. Alexander had not even warmed his throne cushion before the embers of revolt began glowing. Imagine being 20, barely out of adolescence, and suddenly having to prove to every suspicious general, jealous cousin, and rebellious city that you were not to be trifled with. No pressure, right? But Alexander knew that hesitation was death. He acted with astonishing speed. While rebels expected dithering, the young king rallied his army, battle-hardened veterans who had marched with the Philip. They knew Alexander's skill at Chaeronea. They trusted his leadership. With them at his back, he marched south into Greece like a thunderstorm rolling across the plains. His message was clear. There was no pause. Macedon was still master. In 335 BCE, Alexander launched a lightning campaign through Greece, quelling rebellions and reaffirming Macedonian dominance. He moved so swiftly that city after city surrendered without much resistance. His reputation, sharpened in battle and reinforced by ruthless speed, became his greatest weapon. As he advanced, envoys scurried from Athens, from Corinth, from other states, offering words of loyalty. Most of them realized quickly that it was better to bend the knee than to face Macedonian spears. But Thebes made a fateful mistake. Believing Alexander too young and too green, they gambled. They rose in full revolt, drove out the Macedonian garrison, and declared independence. Other Greeks watched nervously. If Thebes succeeded, the spell of Macedonian domination might shatter. If they failed, the consequences would be dire. Thebes was no minor village. It had a proud military tradition, the city that once humbled Sparta, the home of the sacred band, or what remained of them after Chaeronea. Their walls were strong, their fighters fierce, and Alexander, he was still young enough to feel the sting of insult personally. This was no mere political problem. It was a test of his very right to rule. When news reached Alexander, he did not hesitate. He marched on Thebes with terrifying speed, covering hundreds of miles in days. The Thebans could not believe it. Rumor had him far away in Thrace, yet suddenly he was at their gates. It was as though he had appeared out of nowhere, a phantom army conjured from the dust. Panic spread in the city. Some wanted to negotiate, others to fight. Alexander offered them one chance. Surrender and spare your city. They refused. Perhaps they believed other Greeks would rally to their side. Perhaps they underestimated him. Either way, their gamble sealed their fate. The siege began. Macedonian siege engines rumbled forward. Ladders scraped against walls. Arrows hissed through the air. The Thebans fought fiercely, women and children hurling stones from rooftops, defenders shouting defiance. But Alexander's army was relentless. He directed assaults with precision, his companion cavalry, alley striking like a hammer against the defenders. Finally, the walls were breached. Macedonian soldiers poured into the city. The fighting devolved into slaughter in the narrow streets. And then came one of the most infamous moments of Alexander's reign. To make an example, to terrify others from rebellion, he ordered Thebes destroyed. The city was sacked, its buildings torn down, its people killed or sold into slavery. Ancient sources say 6,000 Thebans were slain, another 30,000 enslaved. The once proud city was reduced to rubble, its independence erased in a single brutal stroke. A quirky tidbit. According to some accounts, Alexander spared only two groups: the house of the poet Pindar, whose verses he admired, and the temples. Imagine that, entire neighborhoods leveled, but one poet's descendants allowed to live because Alexander respected his art. Priorities. It is a strange detail, but it reveals how deeply literature and culture mattered to him, even amid carnage. Historians still argue whether the destruction of Thebes was Alexander's personal decision or urged by the League of Corinth, the federation of Greek states Philip had created. Some claim Alexander. He wanted to make an example. Others say the League demanded punishment for Theban treachery. Either way, the outcome was the same. Thebes ceased to exist as a power, and the rest of Greece trembled. The message worked. Athens, which had hesitated, quickly backed down, sending envoys to apologize. Corinth and other cities reaffirmed their loyalty. Greece, stunned by the swiftness and severity of the response, fell silent. Alexander had secured his throne not with words, but with fire and blood. No one doubted now that he was his father's son, and perhaps even more dangerous. But let us not pretend this was an easy moment for Alexander. Imagine walking through the smoldering ruins, hearing the wails of enslaved families, smelling the acrid smoke of burned homes. Even for a hardened warrior, it must have been sobering. He was young, ambitious, and ruthless, but he was also human. Did he feel a pang of guilt, or did he see only necessity? Historians still argue whether Alexander regretted Thebes or whether he considered it simply the cost of power. For the Greeks, the destruction of Thebes was a scar that lasted for generations. Poets lamented, citizens whispered, parents told them, "Our children, do not rebel against Macedon. Remember Thebes." For Alexander, it was a defining moment, proof that rebellion would be crushed without mercy, proof that the boy king was not to be trifled with. The campaign ended with Greece subdued. Alexander was confirmed as leader of the League of Corinth, the federation that Philip had created. He was now the official commander of all Greece in the coming war against Persia. The irony was bitter. The same cities that dreamed of freedom now pledged soldiers and ships to his grand campaign. Macedon's dominance was secure, and Alexander's authority absolute. At 21, he had already crossed a line few rulers ever dared. He had not just won battles, he had destroyed a great city to cement his rule. That act, brutal as it was, ensured that when he marched eastward, his rear was secure. No city wanted to be the next Thebes. Fear, as much as loyalty, bound Greece to him. And so Alexander stood on the cusp of his next great adventure. Behind him lay smoldering ruins, terrified obedience, and a Greece united by force. Ahead lay the vast Persian Empire, stretching from the Aegean to the Indus, rich in gold, armies, and kings. He had secured his throne. Now he would test himself against the greatest power of his age. Imagine him that night standing outside his tent, the stars wheeling overhead. He had crushed rebellion, cowed the proudest cities of Greece, and secured his command. Yet rather than satisfaction, what he felt was restlessness. For Alexander, victory was never enough. Thebes was ashes. Greece was quiet, but his eyes were already turned eastward toward Asia, where the real glory waited. Crossing into Asia, the smoke of Thebes still lingered in memory, though Alexander had left its ruins behind. He was no longer just the king of Macedon, nor merely the commander of Greek troops. He was the undisputed leader of the League of Corinth. At 21, with Greece cowed into submission, his gaze finally fixed eastward across the Aegean Sea toward the vast Persian Empire. This, after all, was his father's dream. Philip had planned to invade Persia, to avenge past Greek humiliations, and to seize the wealth of Asia. Now, with Philip gone, the task fell to his son. Picture Alexander standing on the coast, the salt air in his lungs, staring at the hazy horizon where sea and sky blurred. Behind him, Greece led, I subdued, fearful after the obliteration of Thebes. Ahead, across the water, stretched an empire that dwarfed his own in size, resources, and manpower. Persia was a giant, its kings controlling lands from modern-day Turkey to Egypt, from Babylon to India. Darius III sat on the throne, commanding armies in the hundreds of thousands. Against him stood Alexander with barely 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was David versus Goliath. Except this David carried a copy of Homer in one hand and the legacy of his father in the other. Before marching, Alexander made preparations. He secured Macedon's borders, appointing Antipater, a trusted general, as regent to govern while he campaigned abroad. He raised funds by borrowing heavily, even pawning royal treasures. His gamble was total. He left Macedon nearly broke, betting everything on conquest. If he failed, the kingdom would collapse. If he succeeded, the world would be his. High stakes, all in Alexander's style. When spring arrived in 334 BCE, the invasion began. Ships ferried the Macedonian army across the narrow strait known as the Hellespont, the modern Dardanelles. The crossing was not just military. It was symbolic. For the Greeks, the Hellespont was legendary. Centuries earlier, Xerxes' Persian army had crossed it to invade Greece. Now, Alexander crossed in the opposite direction, claiming revenge. He halted on the Asian shore, leaped from his ship still in armor, and cast a spear into the soil. According to legend, he declared the land won by the spear. It was theatrical, bold, and so Alexander. Upon landing, Alexander visited the ruins of Troy. He sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles, his personal hero. He took part in ceremonies as if he were communing with the spirit of his ancestor. In fact, he ran a race naked around the tomb, following ancient custom, and hung a garland on it. Hephaestion, his closest companion, honored Patroclus in the same way. The message was clear. Alexander was Achilles reborn, come to live out a new epic. A quirky tidbit. Supposedly, he also borrowed Achilles' actual shield from a temple to use in battle. Whether this is literal truth or later embellishment, the idea is deliciously theatrical. The young king strapping on a relic from Homer's age, ready to fight Persians as though they were Trojans. Talk about cosplay at a world historical scale. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely believed he was descended from Achilles or whether he cynically used the myth to inspire his men. Some sources portray him as a true believer in divine lineage, others as a master of propaganda. Either way, his soldiers bought into it, and so did many of his enemies. If you want to be seen as invincible, being cast as Achilles is a good start. The first Persian response came swiftly. Darius was still far away, but satraps, the provincial governors in Asia Minor, mustered troops to repel the invaders. At the river Granicus near the coast, Alexander faced his first major battle against Persian forces. The setting was a shallow river with steep and slippery banks, Persians arrayed on the far side, cavalry glittering in the sun. Some of Alexander's generals urged caution. "Do not attack across a river," they warned. "Wait until morning. Find a safer crossing." But Alexander, young and eager, rejected hesitation. He knew a bold strike would terrify the enemy and boost his own legend. He ordered an immediate assault. Picture the scene. Macedonian cavalry plunging into the river. Water churning, arrows hissing overhead. Alexander himself left, D from the front, helmet flashing, plume bobbing, his horse Bucephalus splashing through the current. On the opposite bank, Persian horsemen braced for the charge, their armor gleaming. The collision was brutal. Spears shattered, swords flashed, horses reared and screamed. In the chaos, Alexander carved a path, personally striking down Persian nobles. At one point, he was nearly killed, saved only when a companion cut down the foe who had raised a sword above him. The young king fought like a warrior of Homer, reckless but unstoppable. The result was a Macedonian victory. Persian forces scattered, leaving the field littered with bodies. Alexander captured enormous spoils, including the families of Persian nobles, whom he treated with calculated respect. The psychological impact was huge. The Persians, once seen as invincible, had been beaten by a 22-year-old at his very first battle in Asia. Word spread quickly. The boy king was dangerous. After Granicus, Alexander began his sweep through Asia Minor. Cities fell to him one by one. Some surrendered voluntarily, hoping for mercy. Others resisted and were punished. Sardis, a wealthy city, opened its gates. Others, like Halleck, Arnasius, resisted fiercely. Alexander showed both ruthlessness and pragmatism. Where loyalty was offered, he accepted. Where rebellion flared, he crushed. Already his style of rule was clear. Carrot and stick, generosity mixed with terror. Life on campaign was grueling. Soldiers marched under scorching sun, ate barley bread and onions, and drank brackish water. Yet morale stayed high. Why? Because Alexander shared their hardships. He marched beside them, ate their rations, and slept on the ground. He was not a distant king on a gilded throne. He was there in the mud, laughing, cursing, and bleeding with them. It built a bond deeper than discipline alone. When he asked them to march into fire, they did, because he had already done it. In these months, Alexander also cultivated his image as liberator of Greek cities under Persian rule. He strode into temples, restored local democracies, and posed as champion of freedom. To the Greeks, he was avenger of Xerxes' invasion. To Persians, he was a dangerous invader. To his soldiers, he was the hero of a new epic. Image, propaganda, and myth all swirled together in the young king's march across Asia Minor. A quirky tidbit: in one capture, D city, Alexander supposedly found a golden couch and insisted on using it, not because he needed comfort, but because he wanted to dramatize that he had taken the very seat of Persian nobility. "If you want to rule Asia," he joked, "you must get used to their furniture." His men roared with laughter. The mix of swagger and humor only deepened their devotion. As he pressed forward, the scale of his ambition became clear. Most would be satisfied with victories along the coast, perhaps securing tribute. Alexander was not. He wanted the heart of Persia, the throne of Darius, the empire itself. His eyes are set far beyond Asia Minor, far beyond the Aegean. He is thinking already of Babylon, of Bucephalus, of the edges of the known world. That restless drive, never stopping, never satisfied, is both his greatest strength and his greatest curse. By the end of 334 BCE, Alexander has carved a foothold in Asia. His army is bloodied but victorious. His reputation is soaring, his enemies unnerved. He has crossed the sea, claimed the land by the spear, and defeated Persia's first defense. Yet greater challenges lie ahead. The Persian Empire is vast, its resources immense. Darius III has yet to meet him in person. The battles to come will test Alexander not just as a warrior, but as a strategist, diplomat, and leader of men on an epic scale. And so the young king, still only in his early 20s, strides deeper into Asia. Behind him, Greece remains subdued. Ahead, Persia stretches vast and glittering, waiting to be claimed or to crush him. Alexander does not doubt. Doubt for him is death. He has crossed into Asia, and he will not turn back. The boy who once tamed Bucephalus, who once sparred under Aristotle's gaze, who once charged into the sacred band at Chaeronea, now steps fully into the role of conqueror. The world stage lies open before him, and he intends to play the starring role. The summer heat of Asia Minor has given way to the chill winds of late autumn, but Alexander's momentum does not cool. With the victory at Granicus behind him, he drives deeper into Persian territory, weaving through coastal cities, tightening his grip on Western Asia. His men are toughened. His name spreads like wildfire, and his confidence grows with each passing mile. Yet the true test, the moment where myth and reality will collide, still lies ahead. For Persia is stirring, and Darius III, the great king himself, finally prepares to face the upstart from Macedon. The Persian Empire is immense, its wealth staggering. Darius can summon armies far larger than anything Alexander commands. When the young king crossed into Asia, he brought perhaps 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Against him now gathers a host many times that size. Estimates soar to over 100,000, though ancient writers, never shy of exaggeration, claimed even more. Picture it, a sea of men, spears bristling, banners snapping, war cries echoing across the plain. To most, the sight alone would have been enough to trigger retreat, but Alexander is not most commanders. For him, the greater the odds, the greater the glory. As autumn of 333 BCE deepens, the two forces move toward each other. Darius takes up position near the town of Issus, along the narrow coastal plain of southern Anatolia. Geography plays its part. Mountains hem the land to the east, the Mediterranean to the west. The battlefield is tight, leaving little room for maneuver. For Alexander, this is a gift. In open terrain, Darius's numbers could encircle and overwhelm him. Here, in the bottleneck of Issus, sheer numbers matter less. It is as though fate itself is leveling the playing field. Imagine the Macedonian camp the night before battle. Fires flicker, casting long shadows on weary faces. Soldiers chew their bread, sharpen their spears, murmur prayers. Some joke nervously, others fall silent. And in the center, Alexander himself walks among them, cloak drawn close, speaking softly. He is not perched on a throne. He is there, eye to eye, reminding them of past victories, promising them glory. He points to the stars overhead and tells them that Achilles himself once looked upon the same sky. He jokes that if the Persians are bringing so many men, it only makes their task easier. More for us too, O beat. The laughter ripples, easing fear. His genius is not just strategy, it is presence. The Battle of Issus, fought on November 5, 333 BCE, was the first time Alexander faced Darius directly. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Alexander's tactical brilliance and the discipline of his phalanx secured a decisive victory. At dawn, the armies face one another across the Pinarus River. The Persians, glittering in bright armor, stretch across the plain, cavalry massed on their left, Greek mercenaries in the center. At their heart sits Darius, elevated on a high chariot, surrounded by royal guards, his presence meant to awe. On the other side, Alexander arrays his men with cold precision. The Macedonian phalanx with its sarissas, pikes twice the length of traditional Greek spears, anchors the center. On the right, Alexander himself leads the companion cavalry, the hammer that will smash through. The air is sharp with tension. Trumpets blare, drums beat, the ground trembles beneath marching feet. Then, with a shout, the Macedonians surge forward, the phalanx advancing like a wall of steel. Spears bristle, shields lock, the line driving into the Persians. The clash is thunderous. Alexander does not linger behind. On Bucephalus, he rides straight into the thick of the fighting, his cavalry sweeping against the Persian left. Water splashes as horses pound across the shallow river. Arrows hiss, men scream. Bronze clangs against iron. In the chaos, Alexander's helmet plume flashes like a beacon, his spear thrusting again and again. He is everywhere at once. General, warrior, symbol. Meanwhile, the Persian center presses hard, their Greek mercenaries slamming against the Macedonian phalanx. For a moment, the line buckles. The fighting is savage, the ground slick with mud and blood. Macedonian spearmen strain, teeth clenched, pushing against overwhelming force. Alexander glances over, sees the crisis, and makes his move. Leading his cavalry in a furious charge, he punches into the Persian flank, rolling their line like parchment in a fire. And then comes the moment that changes everything. Alexander drives directly toward Darius himself. His companions cut down guards. Chariots splinter under the assault, and suddenly the great king of Persia, ruler of millions, sees death galloping toward him. Fear seizes him. Darius turns his chariot and flees, abandoning his whole army. The sight is devastating. If the king himself is running, what hope remains? Panic spreads like wildfire. Persian soldiers throw down weapons, stumbling over one another in desperate retreat. The battle is won. The Macedonians pursue relentlessly, cutting down thousands. The field becomes a rout, Persian corpses strewn across the mud. But Alexander, ever theatrical, halts pursuit when he sees Darius's abandoned chariot. Inside lie Darius's mother, wife, and children. Captured, terrified, they expect humiliation or death. Instead, Alexander treats them with respect, even reverence. He assures them they will not be harmed, that they will be honored as royalty. He even allows them to remain together, refusing to exploit them for propaganda. It is a calculated mercy, one that earns him admiration even from enemies. A quirky tidbit. When Darius's mother accidentally mistook Hephaestion for Alexander, bowing low before him, Alexander reportedly laughed and said, "You were not wrong, mother. He too is Alexander." It is a small moment, but it reveals the depth of his bond with Hephaestion and his knack for turning awkwardness into charm. Historians still argue whether Darius's flight was cowardice or pragmatism. Some say he fled in shame, abandoning his men. Others argue that a king's duty was survival, not personal heroics, that by living he could raise another army. Either way, the optics were disastrous. To the Persians, their king's retreat looked like betrayal. To Alexander's men, it looked like divine confirmation. Their leader was unstoppable. The aftermath of Issus was staggering. Persian casualties were immense, Macedonian losses minimal. Alexander captured not only Darius's family but also immense treasures, gold, and supplies. The psychological blow to Persia was catastrophic. Across the empire, whispers spread. Perhaps the gods favored the Macedonian. Perhaps the great king was not so great after all. For Alexander, Issus was more than victory. It was validation. He had faced the full might of Persia and triumphed. He had stood within spear's reach of Darius and driven him from the field. He had transformed from an ambitious upstart into a genuine world conqueror. His soldiers cheered him, cities trembled before him, and poets would sing of Issus for centuries. That night, the Macedonian camp was jubilant. Fires blazed, wine flowed, soldiers saw ng of their king. Alexander walked among them smiling, but his mind was already racing ahead. Issus was not the end. It was the beginning. Persia remained vast, its armies unbroken, its treasures immense. But now, for the first time, it seemed conquerable. The young king, mud still on his boots, blood still on his spear, gazed eastward. He had defeated Darius once, and he would chase him again. For Alexander, the road only ever led forward. Pharaoh of Egypt. The battlefield of Issus was behind him, its mud still soaked with Persian blood. But Alexander did not stop to savor. Victory was sweet, yet the empire he faced was vast, and Darius still breathed. For Alexander, conquest was never about one battle. It was about momentum. And so instead of pursuing Darius immediately into the heart of Mesopotamia, he turned south toward the wealthy coastal lands that fed Persia's empire. His target was Egypt, jewel of the Nile, land of pyramids, pharaohs, and gods. Why Egypt? Strategy, as always, dictated his path. The Persian fleet still controlled the sea, threatening his supply lines. To cut the Persians off, Alexander had to seize the coastal cities of Phoenicia and then Egypt. With that, seaports in his grasp, Persia's navy would wither. And Egypt itself was rich, grain, gold, and culture. Conquer Egypt, and not only did he strike at Persia's lifeline, but he also wrapped himself in the mantle of a god-king. A king who wanted to rule the world needed more than spears. He needed symbols, and Egypt was overflowing with symbols. So in 332 BCE, Alexander marched south. The road was long, hot, and bitter. But his men, hardened by victory, trudged forward. Along the way, they encountered the great fortified cities of Phoenicia. Sidon surrendered quickly, sensing the winds of fate. But Tyre was another matter. A wealthy island city half a mile offshore, surrounded by towering walls. Tyre refused to yield. The Tyrians mocked Alexander, certain that no siege engines could reach them. Bad move. Alexander, stubborn as stone, ordered a causeway built, stretching across the sea to the island. For 7 months, his men hauled stones, timber, and rubble, inching closer while under constant attack. Imagine the sweat, the curses, the sheer grind of building a bridge to a city that did not want you there. It was an engineering feat as much as a battle. Finally, Macedonia. Siege towers rumbled forward across the causeway, battering the walls. After brutal fighting, Tyre fell. The punishment was savage. Thousands were slaughtered, survivors sold into slavery. Alexander was merciless when defied, but also careful. He allowed Tyre's temples to stand, dedicating offerings as if to say, "I punish rebellion, but I respect the gods." Word spread fast. Better to open your gates than test this man's patience. From there, Gaza fell after fierce resistance. Another bloody reminder of Alexander's relentlessness. The road to Egypt lay open. When Alexander entered Egypt in late 332 BCE, something remarkable happened. The Egyptians welcomed him. To them, Persia had been an oppressive overlord for centuries. Persian kings treated Egypt like a conquered province, not a partner. Alexander, by contrast, strode in as a liberator. Cities opened their gates. Priests greeted him with hymns. Crowds cheered. For once, there was no bloody siege, no smoldering ruins. Instead, Alexander basked in the warmth of adoration. You can almost picture him, dust-streaked from campaigning, riding into Memphis with flowers raining from balconies, his soldiers grinning in disbelief. After months of resistance and bloodshed, Egypt felt like a reward. The Egyptians hailed Alexander as pharaoh, their god-king. He performed the rituals, offering sacrifices to the gods, and was crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In their eyes, he was not a foreign invader, but the rightful ruler chosen by the divine order. A quirky tidbit. During the ceremonies, Alexander supposedly paused to personally handle a sacred bull, Apis, stroking it and leading it in sacrifice. Egyptians, shocked and delighted, took this as proof that he truly respected their traditions. Imagine the scene. Macedonian soldiers whispering, "Our king is cuddling a bull." But for Egyptians, this was no joke. It was holy, a sign of legitimacy. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely embraced Egyptian religion or whether it was purely political theater. Some say he sincerely sought divine validation. Others argue he was simply pragmatic, adapting to local customs to secure loyalty. Whatever his inner beliefs, the outcome was the same. The Egyptians adored him. But Alexander did more than accept the crown. He left a mark that would endure for millennia. He founded a city on the Mediterranean, European coast near the Nile Delta. He ordered a new settlement laid out, Alexandria. Designed with straight streets, harbors, and grand plans, Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities of antiquity, a hub of trade, learning, and culture. Standing on the shore, Alexander supposedly sketched the outline in flour, marking streets and walls. When birds swooped in to eat the flour, his men panicked. But Alexander declared it a good omen. The city would feed the world. He was not wrong. At this moment, Alexander could have paused, luxuriated in Egypt's riches. But rest was not in his nature. He decided to visit the oracle of Ammon at Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert. Why? Because only there could he receive confirmation of his divine lineage. To be merely pharaoh was not enough. He wanted to be recognized as the son of a god. So he and a small party trekked across the scorching sands, days of blistering heat, waterskins running low, men stumbling. At one point, lost in a sandstorm, guides despaired, but Alexander insisted they would find the way. Miraculously, they did. Some say snakes slithered ahead to guide them, or that crows circled above. Tales, perhaps, but tales that will fit the myth. At Siwa, the oracle greeted him not as a mortal but as the son of Ammon, the Egyptian equivalent of Zeus. Alexander never revealed exactly what was whispered to him, but afterward, he behaved as though the gods themselves had confirmed his divinity. Whether he truly believed or simply used it for propaganda, one thing was clear. From this point on, Alexander carried himself not just as king but as God's chosen. For his soldiers, this was a little awkward. They loved him as a leader, but divine status, that was a stretch. Jokes surely circulated in camp. Next, he will ask us to sacrifice goats in his honor. But Alexander never cared much for modesty. For him, to be divine was not vanity, it was destiny. Egypt changed Alexander. In Greece and Asia Minor, he was a conqueror. In Egypt, he became something more, legitimate, sacred, wrapped in symbols older than his own homeland. He walked among temples where hieroglyphs stretched back centuries, where pharaohs lay entombed in pyramids. He saw himself not as a foreigner, but as an heir. Imagine the shiver of pride, the boy from Pella, now pharaoh of Egypt, standing in halls where gods were once worshipped, knowing his name. He would be carved in stone alongside theirs. And yet he did not linger. Egypt secured, Persia's fleet crippled, Alexander turned his gaze once more eastward. Darius had recovered, raising another massive army. The real showdown awaited. For Alexander, Egypt was both a victory lap and a stepping stone. He had tasted the adoration of being seen as divine, and it only fueled his hunger. At just 24, he had conquered Greece, Phoenicia, and Egypt. He had defeated Persia's armies twice, founded a city destined for greatness, and been crowned pharaoh. Most men would retire in triumph. Alexander was only getting started. Ahead lay the battle that would decide the fate of empires. Gaugamela, the showdown at Gamla. Alexander had worn the double crown of Egypt, heard a god call him son, and founded a city that would shine for centuries. Yet for all his triumphs, he knew the real battle still lay ahead. Darius III, the great king of Persia, was not finished. After his humiliating flight at Issus, he had raised another army, this time larger, better prepared. Determined to crush the Macedonian upstart once and for all. For Alexander, it was the perfect stage. One decisive clash would decide who ruled the known world. The year was 331 BCE. The place was a wide plain near the village of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. Unlike the narrow pass at Issus, which had forced Persia's numbers into a bottleneck, Gaugamela was open, flat, and broad. Perfect for Darius's vast host. Disastrous for Alexander's smaller force, at least in theory. The Persians even smoothed the ground to make it easier for their chariots to charge. Imagine a field so carefully prepared it looked like a racetrack, except instead of horses galloping for roses, they would be charging to kill. Alexander's men numbered perhaps 40,000. Darius's forces, ancient accounts said, anywhere from 200,000 to 1,000,000. Modern historians laugh at the million but still estimate well over 100,000, at least twice, maybe 3 times Alexander's numbers. Facing such odds, most generals would look for excuses to retreat. Alexander, of course, rubbed his hands in anticipation. To him, greater numbers meant greater glory. The night before battle, the Macedonian camp was restless. Soldiers huddled around fires, some sharpening spears, others muttering prayers. In the distance, cyan campfires stretched to the horizon, a sea of flickering lights. It felt like the stars had descended to earth, except each spark represented an enemy ready to kill them. Some Macedonian veterans glanced nervously, but Alexander strode confidently among them, cloak swinging, voice calm. He reminded them of Granicus, of Issus, of Tyre and Gaza, of Egypt welcoming him as pharaoh. "We have faced odds before," he said, "and we have always prevailed. Tomorrow will be no different. The gods march with us." He laughed that Darius had brought so many men it would only make finding him in the crowd easier. Nervous chuckles rippled through the ranks. That was Alexander's gift, turning dread into excitement, fear into fire. On the 1st of October 331 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III at Gaugamela. Despite being outnumbered, his tactical genius and disciplined troops secured a decisive victory, effectively toppling the Persian Empire. At dawn, the armies arrayed. The sight was staggering. Persian cavalry stretched across the field. Scythian chariots gleamed in the sun. War elephants brought from India loomed in the distance. Darius himself stood at the center in a high chariot, led by the immortals, his royal guard, banners fluttering above him. It was a spectacle of imperial power meant to terrify before the first spear was even thrown. Alexander's army, by contrast, looked small, tight, and lean. The phalanx stood ready in the center, pikes bristling. On the right, Alexander led the companion cavalry, his personal hammer. On the left, Parmenion, his trusted general, commanded the Thessalian horse. Their plan was simple but risky. Hold the line against overwhelming numbers, then strike hard where the enemy least expected. The Persians advanced first, chariots charging across the plain. Their wheels bristled with blades meant to mow men down like wheat. Horses screamed, whips cracked, the ground shook. But the Macedonians were ready. At Alexander's order, they opened their lines, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through, then cut down the drivers from the sides. What was meant to be terror turned into chaos. The vaunted chariots meant to shred formations were reduced to wreckage in minutes. Next came the cavalry clash. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion was pressed hard. Persian horsemen flooded against him, threatening to outflank the phalanx. Dust, clouds rose, the sound of hooves thundered. For a moment it seemed the line might break, but Parmenion held, stubborn and grim. Meanwhile, on the right, Alexander saw his chance. With a shout, he led the companions in a wedge formation, spear pointed forward, charging directly at a gap in the Persian line. Imagine it, Alexander at the tip, Bucephalus charging, plume blazing, companions tight behind. The wedge drove like an arrow into the enemy. They smashed into the Persian cavalry, scattering them, and then angled inward straight toward Darius himself. The sight was terrifying. Once again, the great king watched as Alexander cut through his guard, closing in. Panic gripped him. Despite his vast army, despite his carefully prepared battlefield, Darius lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled. Just as at Issus, the symbol of Persia's power vanished in dust. His men, seeing their king run, began to collapse. Some fought bravely, others threw down their arms. Many were trampled in the stampede. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient accounts say Darius fled so fast he left his cloak, bow and royal chariot behind, essentially his kingly lost and found. Alexander later displayed them as trophies, proof that the so-called great king had fled like a common coward. Macedonian soldiers joked that Darius had donated his wardrobe. Historians still argue whether Darius's flight was cowardice or calculated survival. Was he genuinely terrified, or did he believe his duty was to live and raise another army? Modern scholars lean toward the latter, but in the eyes of his men, the effect was the same. Disaster. Armies fight on confidence, and confidence shattered when their king bolted. The rout was immense. Tens of thousands of Persians died, while Macedonian losses were minimal. The battlefield was littered with broken spears, overturned chariots, and fallen banners. For Alexander, it was not just victory. It was empire. With Gaugamela, Persia was effectively his. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, all would fall in quick succession. The great king had been broken, his empire ripe for the taking. That night, the Macedonian camp erupted in celebration. Soldiers cheered, feasted, and boasted of their deeds. Alexander accepted their praises but remained restless. He knew the war was not over. Darius had fled east, still alive, still a rival. But the symbolic power of Gaugamela company would not be overstated. In one day, a young king from Macedon had defeated the largest empire the world had ever seen. And what of Alexander himself? He was transformed, no longer merely conqueror of Greece, liberator of Egypt, or clever tactician. Now he was master of Asia. He strode among his men with the easy confidence of one who believed destiny bent to his will. His enemies saw him as unstoppable, his allies as God-touched, his soldiers as the greatest leader alive. Imagine him standing alone on the battlefield after the noise died down. The plain stretched silent beneath the stars. Around him lay the remnants of Persia's might. In his heart burned the knowledge that he had achieved what even the heroes of myth never dreamed. Not just victory, but the keys to an empire spanning continents. The boy from Pella, the student of Aristotle, the taming prince of Bucephalus, now the conqueror of Persia. And yet for Alexander, this was not the end. This was never the end. For men like him, glory was a fire that could not be quenched. Ahead still lay Babylon, Persepolis, and the chase after Darius. The world had opened before him, and he intended to claim it all. The King of Kings. The dust of Gaugamela still clung to Alexander's boots. The smell of blood and churned earth had not yet faded from his senses, and already the young conqueror looked ahead. Persia's armies had been broken on the plain. Its great king had fled once again, and the gates of the empire swung open. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, the ancient heartlands of the Achaemenid dynasty, lay waiting. And Alexander, now 25, walked toward them not as an invader, but as something far more intoxicating. As master. When the Macedonian army approached Babylon, the fabled city of Mesopotamia, the outcome was not battle but pageantry. The walls loomed vast, painted and glazed with bright images of lions and dragons. Ziggurats rose into the hot sky, and the Ishtar gate, tiled with blue lapis and golden beasts, glittered like something out of a dream. Instead of resistance, the Babylonians streamed out in welcome. They were weary of Darius's weakness, eager for stability, willing to bow to the man who had crushed the great king. Alexander marched in at the head of his troops, flanked by companions still streaked with dust, phalanx ranks gleaming, cavalry mounts snorting. Drums echoed, trumpets blare, and behind the spectacle lay the real message. Macedon was no longer just a kingdom on the edge of Greece. It was the power that held the throat of Persia. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, opened its gates to Alexander in 331 BCE after Gaugamela. He was received not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler, a sign of just how fragile Persian loyalty to Darius had become. The city dazzled the Macedonians. Soldiers gaped at gardens, markets overflowing with spices, and perfumed courtyards. Some swore they found the hanging gardens themselves, though historians still debate whether those gardens ever existed here or elsewhere. Wine flowed, entertainers performed, and Alexander staged sacrifices to Babylonian gods, eager to present himself not as a foreign plunderer, but as a rightful successor. Priests chanted, incense curled into the air, and Alexander bowed in ritual, half pragmatic politics, half genuine fascination. A quirky tidbit. In Babylon, Alexander supposedly took an interest in the astronomical records kept by priests, clay tablets stretching back centuries, tracking stars and eclipses. Imagine a general who had just smashed the largest empire in the world pausing to ask, so, when is the next lunar eclipse? He was hungry for knowledge as much as for conquest. From Babylon, the march continued to Susa, another jewel of the empire. Here too the gates opened without resistance, and here Alexander struck gold, literally. The royal treasury was captured with hundreds of tons of silver and gold, a staggering fortune. For an army perpetually half-starved of pay, this was paradise. Alexander distributed riches, rewarded loyalty, and ensured his men saw tangible proof of victory. Their young king was not leading them into ruin. He was leading them into wealth beyond imagining. But Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, was different. A symbol of Achaemenid pride, seat of kings, repository of centuries of royal glory. Persepolis did not surrender so easily. The Macedonian army fought its way through, finally storming the city in early 3330 BCE. And here, Alexander's ruthlessness showed again. He allowed his troops to plunder. Palaces were stripped, treasures carried off, Persian nobles slain or enslaved. The Macedonians, long fed on stories of Xerxes burning Athens, saw this as righteous vengeance. They burned our temple. They said, and now we burn theirs. And burn it they did. One night, amid feasting and wine, flames leaped skyward. Whether it was drunken impulse, deliberate revenge, or a cold act of political theater, Persepolis was set ablaze. Columns toppled, roofs collapsed, carvings blackened. The ceremonial heart of Persia became ash. Ancient sources differ. Some say a courtesan named Thais urged Alexander to burn the palace in revenge for Greece. Others say Alexander himself ordered it, then regretted it when sober. Historians still argue whether the destruction was an accident, a calculated symbol, or a hangover's mistake. Whatever the cause, the image was unforgettable. Alexander, torch in hand, watching an empire's glory go up in flames. Yet conquest was not only destruction. Alexander now assumed the title once borne by Darius and Xerxes, King of Kings. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing their robes, sitting on their throne, holding court in their style. To Macedonians, this was shocking. Their rough and ready king suddenly in silk trousers, bowing to Persian etiquette. Many grumbled, muttering about betrayal of Greek values. But Alexander knew symbols mattered. If he was rule not just as a conqueror, but as a ruler, he must be more than Macedonian. He must be Persian too. Alexander began practicing proskynesis, the Persian custom of bowing before the king. To Persians, it was normal. To Greeks, it was outrageous, reserved only for gods. His men resisted, some openly refusing to bow. A quirky tidbit. One story tells that when a Greek refused to bow, Alexander laughed it off, saying it was the thought that counts. Another time, though, when opposition mounted, he snapped that loyalty meant adapting. You can imagine the awkwardness. Hardened Macedonian veterans who had marched with him since boyhood now asked to grovel like courtiers. Not everyone was pleased. Historians still argue whether Alexander's adoption of Persian customs was sincere or calculated. Was he genuinely trying to merge cultures, or simply using ceremony to strengthen control? His marriages to Persian women later suggested he sought real fusion, yet his Macedonian officers often seethed. The balance between Greek and Persian identity became a constant strain on his reign. But for Alexander himself, the transformation was intoxicating. He was no longer the boy of Pella, not even just the victor of Issus or Gaugamela. He was heir to Cyrus, Darius, and Xerxes, the king of kings. He sat in palaces built for god-kings, held audiences with nobles who once bowed only to Persian monarchs, and sent out decrees in languages spanning continents. His empire now stretched from the Aegean to the Persian Gulf. At 26, he had surpassed every Greek hero, every Persian monarch, every ambition his father had dreamed. Yet even in glory, Alexander remained restless. Sitting on a golden throne did not satisfy him. Wealth and titles were fuel, not destination. In the markets of Babylon, he heard tales of India, of elephants larger than houses, of strange rivers, of lands where the sun scorched hotter than any Greek had known. In Persepolis, he looked at maps, tracing rivers eastward, eyes glittering. King of Kings was not enough. He wanted to be master of the ends of the earth. And so, even as Persepolis smoldered, even as Susa's treasures were counted, Alexander began planning his next campaign. Darius still lived, retreating into the east, gathering whatever loyalty he could. To leave him alive was to leave a rival. To Alexander, unfinished business was like hunger. He would not stop until Darius was captured or killed. Imagine him at a feast, goblet of Persian wine in hand, generals sprawled around him. The hall still smelled of smoke from Persepolis. He joked, he laughed, he quoted Homer, but beneath the surface he was plotting. His gaze drifted east, always east. His companions might cheer their wealth, but Alexander was already thinking of deserts to cross, mountains to climb, rivers to ford, enemies to chase. For the boy who tamed Bucephalus, the prince who studied under Aristotle, the youth who shattered the sacred band, the conqueror who burned Persepolis, there could be no rest. He was king of kings now, but in his heart he knew one truth. Kingship was not a crown you wore, it was a fire you had to feed. And Alexander's fire was far from burning out. Marching into India, the palaces of Persepolis were still smoldering memories. The treasures of Susa still glittered in the minds of Macedonian soldiers, and the title King of Kings now hung around Alexander's shoulders like a cloak. Yet even draped in wealth and ceremony, he could not sit still. Eastward always called. The map spread before him showed mountains, deserts, rivers, and, beyond them, lands few Greeks had ever seen. Lands spoken of in half myth, India. But before reaching the fabled subcontinent, Alexander had to finish what he started. Darius III still lived. After Gaugamela, the great king fled eastward, gathering what fragments of loyalty remained. Alexander pursued relentlessly, marching through Media, then into Parthia, across plateaus and mountains. The chase was grueling. Soldiers trudged through snow. Rivers froze around their boots. Icy winds lashed their faces. It was no longer the blazing heat of Issus or the dust of Tyre, but the biting cold of highlands. Yet Alexander pushed them onward, his eyes fixed not on comfort but on destiny. In 330 BCE, near Ecbatana, news reached him. Darius had been betrayed. Satraps once loyal turned against their king. Bessus, a Persian noble, seized Darius, intending to claim power himself. When Alexander's forces closed in, Bessus's men stabbed their king and left him dying in a wagon. Macedonian scouts found the body. Darius, abandoned, breathed his last before Alexander could reach him. Darius III was murdered by his own nobles during his flight, leaving Alexander master of the Persian Empire. Regarding. The scene was heavy with irony. Alexander, who longed to defeat Darius in personal combat, instead found a dying man betrayed and broken. Accounts say he covered the body with his cloak, sending it for a royal burial in Persepolis. Perhaps it was genuine respect for a fellow king. Perhaps it was theatre, a quirky tidbit. Some sources claim Alexander even wept over Darius, declaring that he would have treated him honorably had he been captured alive. Whether tears fell or not, the symbolism mattered. Alexander was not just a conqueror, he was the heir, the rightful king of Asia. Historians still argue whether Alexander's grief was sincere or staged. Some believe he admired Darius, seeing him as a tragic rival rather than an enemy. Others suggest he used the moment to present himself as a noble successor. Whatever the truth, Darius's death left a vacuum, and Alexander stepped in with both feet. He adopted Persian titles, sat in Persian courts, married Persian women, and demanded loyalty from satraps. He was no longer a foreign invader. He was the empire's new master. Yet, as always, his gaze drifted east. Beyond Persia lay lands unknown, the mighty Hindu Kush, the Indus River, elephants larger than houses, kingdoms said to glisten with gold, and Alexander, restless as ever, wanted them all. In 327 BCE, after years consolidating Persia, Alexander began the march toward India. The journey was brutal. His army, now a mix of Macedonian veterans and Persian levies, trudged across the Hindu Kush mountains. Picture it. Narrow passes choked with snow, winds that cut through cloaks, soldiers slipping on icy paths, mules collapsing under loads. Men cursed, stumbled, froze. But Alexander was there among them, enduring the same hardships. He refused comfort, eating what they ate, marching at their pace. This, more than speeches, bound men to him. If their king suffered, they could too. At one pass, so high the sky seemed to press down, soldiers carved steps into ice to haul siege engines across. Think about that, dragging massive wooden machines meant for warm plains over frozen peaks where even goats struggled. It was absurd, almost comical, siege towers inching upward while men slipped and swore. And yet somehow they succeeded. Alexander's bent mountains themselves. When they descended into Bactria and then into the Punjab, the world changed. The air grew warmer, the land greener. Rivers snaked across fertile plains. Strange trees dotted the horizon, and animals the Macedonians had never seen wandered the fields. The soldiers gaped at parrots flashing bright feathers, monkeys swinging through branches, and spices filling the air. To men from Macedon's dry hills, it felt like stepping onto another planet. And then the elephants, towering, armored, trumpeting beasts that seemed more monster than animal. To the Macedonians, who had never faced such creatures in battle, they were terrifying. Imagine a veteran who had fought at Chaeronea, Issus, Gaugamela, Tyre, Bucephalus, and the Hydaspes, who had faced Persian cavalry, scythed chariots, and endless infantry, suddenly staring at a living wall of grey muscle, tusks capped in bronze. You can almost hear him mutter, "Nope, that is not in the training manual." Alexander's campaign in India introduced his army to war elephants, weapons that shocked and terrified Greek soldiers. A quirky tidbit. Supposedly, some Macedonians joked nervously that they would need ladders to spear the beasts, or else convince them to join the companion cavalry. Humor is a soldier's defense against fear. Historians still debate how much Alexander truly intended to conquer India versus simply testing its edges. Some argue he wanted the whole subcontinent. Others believe he merely sought to secure his empire's eastern flank. But one thing is certain: he could not resist the allure of pushing further. The most famous clash came at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE against King Porus. The river was swollen, rushing with monsoon rains. Its banks were guarded by Porus's army, complete with elephants. Crossing seemed impossible. Yet Alexander, master of deception, tricked Porus. He left part of his army in camp to distract while secretly ferrying troops upstream under cover of night and storm. Imagine the darkness, rain lashing, men clinging to rafts, horses swimming beside them, all praying the current did not sweep them away. At dawn, Porus saw Alexander already across. Battle erupted. Macedonian phalanx against elephants. Companion cavalry circling. Arrows raining. The elephants charged, tusks gleaming, trampling men tossing them like ragdolls. Horses panicked at the smell. Soldiers scattered. For the first time, the Macedonians faced genuine terror. But Alexander rallied them, shouting, "Left," leading charges, spears aimed at elephant handlers. Slowly the beasts were wounded, maddened, turning even on their own. The tide shifted. Porus, towering over his men, so tall he supposedly needed 2 horses to ride, fought bravely until wounded and captured. Alexander, impressed by his valor, did something unexpected. He not only spared Porus but restored him as ruler, granting him even more territory. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus answered simply, "Like a king." Alexander, delighted, declared that he would treat him exactly that way. Mercy, theater, and pragmatism all rolled into one. After the Hydaspes, Alexander made Porus a loyal ally, recognizing the value of ruling through local kings. A quirky tidbit. Some soldiers whispered that Alexander spared Porus because he was so tall and imposing. He looked like a hero from Homer, and Alexander could not resist having one on his side. Historians still argue whether the Hydaspes was Alexander's hardest battle. Some call it his finest tactical display. Others note that elephants nearly broke his army. What is clear is that the victory cemented his reputation even in India. Yet the cost was high. Thousands died. Macedonians were exhausted. The monsoon rains drenched camps, food spoiled, disease spread. Soldiers grumbled, longing for home. They had marched from Greece to India, across deserts and mountains, and fought city after city. Their king, insatiable, spoke of crossing further east toward the Ganges, where new kingdoms waited. But the men finally resisted. At the Hyphasis River, when Alexander urged them forward, they refused. A mutiny, silent but firm. Tears in his eyes, Alexander pleaded, reminded them of glory, of Achilles, of destiny. But the veterans shook their heads. Enough was enough. For perhaps the first time, Alexander bowed not to an enemy but to his own men. He agreed to turn back. In anger and sorrow, he retreated to his tent, refusing to eat for days, sulking like a child denied candy. Yet even sulking, he remained Alexander. He ordered massive altars built on the riverbank, monuments proclaiming that he had reached the edge of the world. If he could not go further, he would at least leave a mark. The march into India revealed not only his brilliance, but his limits. He had conquered Persia, humbled Darius, faced elephants, and crossed monsoons, but he could not conquer exhaustion. Even Achilles, after all, needed rest. For Alexander, That truth cut deeper than any spear. The reluctant army. The roar of the Hydaspes still echoed in their bones. The vision of elephants trampling men still haunted their sleep, and yet the army moved eastward. Alexander's heart pounded with the lure of the unknown. Beyond the Hyphasis River, called the Bees by locals, he imagined even greater kingdoms. Rivers broader than seas, cities shining with gold. His soldiers, however, felt only the weight of mud caked on their sandals, the ache of wounds that never healed, and the weariness of 10 years spent marching behind one insatiable man. Here was the irony. The same king who once coaxed men into charging through arrow storms with speeches about glory now found himself facing silence. At the Hyphasis, Alexander summoned his army. Rain fell heavy and endless. The river swelled in the distance, its current fierce. Alexander stood before his veterans, men who had fought beside him at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Tyre, Bucephalus, and the Hydaspes. They were scarred, hardened, loyal beyond reason. Yet when he urged them to march into the unknown, not a cheer rose. Instead of the silence thickened. In 326 BCE, Alexander's army mutinied at the Hyphasis River, refusing to march further into India. He tried persuasion. He reminded them of Troy, of Achilles, of how their deeds would echo in eternity. He pointed eastward, promising riches, promising stories that would shame any who stayed behind. But the men shifted uneasily. Some stared at the ground, some coughed, some crossed their arms over their chests. Finally, a few voices spoke what all thought. "We have gone far enough." Coeneus, one of Alexander's trusted commanders, spoke for the army. He said the men were exhausted, longing for families, for home, for a life beyond endless battles. They had reached the world's edge as far as their courage was concerned. Alexander listened, his jaw tight. Historians still argue whether his tears were genuine grief or calculated theater, but accounts agree that he stormed back to his tent, refusing to eat or speak, sulking for days. A quirky tidbit. Some soldiers joked darkly that their king was behaving like Achilles in his tent, pouting after an insult. The comparison would not have been lost on Alexander, who fashioned his life after Homer's hero. And just like Achilles, Alexander eventually emerged, not to forgive, but to compromise. The decision weighed heavily. He ordered massive altars built at the Hyphasis, towering monuments that declared in stone that Alexander had come this far, to the edge of the known world. If he could not march further, then let future generations know it was his choice to stop, not his army's rebellion. Pride preserved, sort of. Turning back, however, was no mercy. Alexander did not choose the easy road home. No gentle retreat along familiar paths, no retracing of steps. Instead, he planned a grand arc southward along rivers, through hostile territories, across deserts. Some suspect he wished to punish his army by showing them that even retreat would be conquest. Others argue he simply could not resist new horizons, even if they led backward. Historians still argue whether his chosen route was strategic brilliance or reckless cruelty. The march south began with battles. Tribes resisted. Fortresses rose from jungles and plains. Alexander hurled himself at them with the same ferocity as ever. At one city, Multan, he personally led an assault, scaling ladders under a hail of arrows. Soldiers below hesitated, but Alexander climbed alone, leaping onto the walls, striking defenders with sword and shield. It was reckless, mad, yet utterly in character. Then came disaster. As he led the charge inside, an arrow pierced his chest, puncturing a lung. Blood gushed, air hissed. The king collapsed. Panic spread. Alexander, invincible, struck down. His men fought desperately, hauling him away, desperate to save him. For days, he hovered between life and death. Alexander was gravely wounded at Multan in 326 BCE, nearly dying from a chest wound. A quirky tidbit. Some accounts claim his soldiers, fearing rumors of his death, paraded him on a ship with his chest bandaged just to prove he lived. Imagine it. Alexander, pale as parchment, coughing blood, waving weakly to reassure thousands of anxious eyes. A grim but almost comedic puppet show of vitality. Historians still argue about how close to death he came. Some suggest it was a miraculous recovery. Others say later writers exaggerated the wound for drama. Either way, the scar remained, a reminder that even gods could bleed. When he recovered barely, Alexander did not slow. He led the army further down the Indus, storming more cities, defeating and ending submission. His obsession seemed feverish now, as if the arrow in his chest had spurred him to burn brighter before he burned out. His soldiers obeyed, but murmurs grew. They were tired of jungles, rains, and endless resistance. The monsoon lashed their camps. Supplies rotted. Fever spread. Each day the army grew thinner, hungrier, and more resentful. And then the desert. To return west, Alexander chose a route across the Gedrosian Desert, modern Macron, one of the harshest landscapes on earth. Why? Some say it was punishment for his army's refusal at the Hyphasis. Others argue he sought to rival legendary expeditions, proving he could march where no one else dared. Whatever the reason, the result was misery. Picture it. Endless sand, burning sun, winds that seared skin, dunes that swallowed men whole. Water vanished. Wells were poisoned or dry. Horses collapsed. Camels staggered. Men died by the hundreds. They left bodies half buried in sand, dunes covering them within hours. Supplies ran out, so soldiers chewed leather straps, gnawed roots, and drank brackish water that scalded their throats. It was less an army than a procession of ghosts. Alexander's march through the Gedrosian Desert in 325 BCE caused massive losses to his army, with thousands dying of thirst and starvation. A quirky tidbit. Supposedly, one day scouts found a tiny pool of water and brought a helmet full to Alexander. He looked at it, then poured it into the sand before the men, declaring he would not drink unless all could. Soldiers wept, not sure if from thirst or loyalty, and trudged on. Historians still argue whether the event actually happened or was polished legend, but like most stories about Alexander, truth and theatre blended seamlessly. Through it all, Alexander pressed forward, stubborn as ever. His men grumbled, yet they followed, bound not by love anymore but by the momentum of years. Some dreamed of Macedon, of wives and children left behind. Others muttered curses under their breath, wondering if their king sought conquest or just his own immortality. The answer, of course, was both. By the time they staggered out of the desert into more fertile lands, the army was half destroyed, ragged and broken. Yet Alexander still burned with ambition. He reorganized satrapies, founded new cities and planned fleets. His soldiers could barely stand, but their king was already scheming about Arabia, about Carthage, about Rome, lands they had only heard of in stories. And here lay the paradox of Alexander's life. His army, reluctant, battered and mutinous, remained with him. They hated him, loved him, resented him, and worshipped him. He was a tyrant and a savior, a reckless dreamer and a calculating strategist. A man who had nearly killed them all, yet bound them to his name forever. As they limped westward, no one knew it yet, but their greatest hardships were not over. They would see Babylon again, but not the Alexander they remembered. His relentless drive was consuming him from within, and the reluctant army would soon become the mourning army. When Alexander finally emerged from the nightmare of the Gedrosian desert, the sun felt different. No longer a merciless god hammering his men into dust, but a softer warmth that glittered on irrigated fields, fat cattle, and bustling villages. The survivors staggered forward like revenants, gaunt and scarred, their sandals worn to strips, their eyes hollow. And yet, there was life again, water again, bread again. Babylon waited, not with sandstorms or poisoned wells, but with grandeur. For years, Babylon had been both prize and playground for Alexander. He had first marched into it after crushing Darius at Gaugamela, greeted not as a destroyer but as a liberator. Its colossal walls and ziggurats shimmered under torchlight then, and they shimmered still, a jewel on the Euphrates. Now, in 324 BCE, the city readied itself once again for its king. Caravans raced ahead, announcing his approach. Artisans prepared garlands, priests polished altars. To the Babylonians, this was not just a king returning. It was a god returning. The army dragged itself behind him, shuffling shadows of what they once were. Even they could not help but stare when Babylon's gates loomed on the horizon. Towers climbed skyward, gardens cascaded with green, canals glittered like veins of silver. Some whispered that the Hanging Gardens, one of the wonders of the world, still survived somewhere beyond those walls. Whether myth or truth, the city's majesty silenced them. After endless deserts, it looked like paradise. In 324 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon after years of campaigning, choosing it as his new capital. Alexander entered in triumph, though triumph now carried shadows. Trumpets sounded, incense. The clouds rose, thousands thronged the streets. The Babylonians chanted his name not as invader, but as king. Alexander rode tall, his armor gleaming. Yet beneath the gold was a man who had survived wounds, fevers, grief, mutiny, and near death. To the crowd, he was unstoppable. To his soldiers, he was unrelenting. To himself, perhaps he was both. There was celebration, of course. Feasts spilled through the avenues. Wine flowed like rivers. Dancers twirled in silks. But Babylon was not only for celebration, it was for ambition. Alexander was no longer content with a nomad's tent or a battlefield's dust. Here, in the navel of empires, he dreamed of a world government. Plans unfurled on wax tablets. New fleets on the Persian Gulf, new roads connecting east to west, new trade routes weaving from India to the Mediterranean. He envisioned Babylon as the beating heart of an empire so vast that no border could contain it. Historians still argue whether these plans were genuine or grandiose sketches of a restless mind. Was Alexander about to launch expeditions into Arabia, perhaps even Africa, or were these only fantasies whispered between wine cups? The truth lies buried with him, but the fragments tantalize. The army, meanwhile, tasted both relief and unease. Relief because Babylon offered rest, food, and women. Unease because Alexander's gaze still pointed outward. After a decade of war, they craved permanence. He craved movement, a quirky tidbit. At one of the grand feasts, Alexander supposedly hosted a drinking contest among his soldiers. One man, a Thessalian named Cletus, drank himself to death within days. Another, a soldier named Promachus, allegedly consumed nearly 4 gallons of unmixed wine in a single sitting, then promptly collapsed and died. Imagine that as your war medal. Not wounds, not scars, but death by bottomless goblet. Alexander himself was known to drink prodigiously, though whether his tolerance matched his ambition was another debate. The city also became a stage for pageantry. In 324 BCE, Alexander organized the famous Susa weddings, though Babylon inherited the afterglow of their spectacle. Thousands of his soldiers were married to Persian women, a fusion ceremony meant to blend Macedonian and Persian elites into one family. Alexander himself took 2 wives of royal Persian blood, including Statera, daughter of Darius. To him, it was unity. To his men, it felt like cultural coercion. They married because they were told to, not because they wished to. Still, garlands were woven, vows exchanged, and wine consumed. The Susa marriages of 324 BCE were Alexander's attempt to merge Macedonian and Persian cultures. Though most of these unions dissolved after his death, the army grumbled quietly, mocking Alexander behind closed tents. "First he made us Persians in dress," they muttered, recalling the hated robes and rituals. "Now he makes us Persians in bed." Some kept their brides, others abandoned them. Historians still argue whether Alexander genuinely sought cultural unity or whether these marriages were pragmatic attempts to secure loyalty from Persian nobility. Either way, the experiment faltered as soon as his charisma could no longer enforce it. But Babylon did not just host weddings, it hosted omens, and omens clung to Alexander's return like shadows. One story claimed that as he approached the city, priests begged him not to enter, warning of ill omens, an eclipse, an unfavorable alignment of the stars. Others whispered that the city's gates had been cursed and that the king's death would soon follow if he passed through them. Alexander, half believer and half skeptic, detoured into the city by a side entrance, perhaps mocking the prophecy, perhaps hedging his bets. Historians still argue whether this tale was superstition retroactively stitched to his fate, or whether he truly feared Babylon's gods. Inside the city, he threw himself into projects with feverish energy. Shipyards sprang up along the Euphrates. Thousands of laborers fashioned timbers, sails, and oars. Alexander dreamed of a navy to explore the Persian Gulf and beyond. He reorganized satrapies, punished corrupt officials, and rewarded loyal ones. His handwriting streaked across clay tablets as he dictated orders day and night. Yet something else stirred in Babylon. The king was slowing down. Not outwardly, His gestures remained fiery. His voice carried. But within, the wound at Multan ached. Fevers seized him at night. He drank heavily, perhaps to numb pain, perhaps to silence the whisper that mortality was closer than he dared admit. His friends noticed. His generals whispered. The aura of invincibility wavered. Alexander fell ill and died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32. The cause remains one of history's greatest mysteries, but not yet. In these months, he still planned. Arabia beckoned. He sketched fleets, drafted logistics, imagined roads carved through deserts. His army, weary, hoped these were only words, yet they knew him. He had never stopped at words. A quirky tidbit. Supposedly, when asked what he intended to do after conquering the world, Alexander replied, "Rest." Some scholars suggest it was a joke, a sardonic wink at his insatiable hunger. Others believe he meant it, and that Babylon was meant as his throne of rest at last. Historians still argue whether Alexander was capable of resting at all. For now, Babylon hummed. The streets thronged with merchandise, ants and mercenaries, astrologers and philosophers. The palace resounded with music and laughter, but also with arguments and schemes. Alexander sat at the center, both spider and fly, weaving dreams larger than any city could hold. His army, reluctant but bound, watched, ate, healed, and waited. What they could not know was how swiftly this stage would darken. The gods of Babylon were not done with Alexander, and neither were the weaknesses of his own body. The fevers that shook him at night were not just passing ailments, they were heralds. The greatest conqueror the world had seen was about to face an enemy no sword could slay. The fall of the conqueror. The spring air in Babylon was heavy, clinging to the skin like warm silk, perfumed by gardens and river reeds, and yet tinged with something uneasy. The soldiers lounging in shaded courtyards sensed it. The courtiers bustling through the palace halls sensed it. Even the priests of Marduk, who had watched kings rise and fall for centuries, whispered it. Alexander was restless, and Babylon itself seemed to thrum with the uncertainty of what came next. Only months before, he had strode into the city like a triumphant god. Now a fragile shadow tugged at the edges of his aura. His body bore the proof of campaigns without pause, scars that crossed his torso like lightning bolts, a shoulder that never healed quite right, a thigh pierced by an arrow, lungs damaged from fevers caught in Indian jungles. He still carried himself like the Alexander of old, straight-backed, bronze-skinned, with eyes that seemed to bore into eternity. But those closest to him noticed the tremors when he drank too much wine, or the way he winced when rising from his throne. Historians still argue whether Alexander's decline was obvious to all or only to the inner circle. Was he a visibly weakened king masking fragility with grandeur, or was he still the image of invincibility, undone only by sudden illness? The surviving accounts differed wildly. One constant remained: ambition. Even as his body faltered, his mind raced. Plans for the conquest of Arabia unfolded on wax tablets and clay records. He envisioned fleets sailing out from the Persian Gulf, probing the southern coasts, then circling into the Red Sea. Roads would snake through deserts. Cities would spring up like pearls on a necklace. The empire's spine would stretch ever forward. Arthur. For Alexander, Babylon was no resting place. It was a launch pad. His men, though, groaned in silence. Arabia sounded like another endless trial. They had marched through mountains, deserts, and jungles. They had buried brothers in foreign soils. They had carried Alexander's dreams on their backs long past endurance. Now, in the wealth of Babylon, with food, wine, and women in plenty, they wanted peace. Alexander, as always, wanted more. In the months before his death in 323 BCE, Alexander was planning a major Arabian campaign, with fleets and supplies already under preparation. The palace was a swirl of activity. Architects sketched blueprints for canals. Shipwrights hammered timbers along the Euphrates. Couriers raced back and forth, firing orders to distant satrapies. Amid this storm, Alexander presided like a conductor, barking commands, dreaming aloud, scribbling notes deep into the night. He could not stop. Perhaps he would not stop. But Babylon was not merely a city of marble and plans. It was a city of omens, and omens once again stalked Alexander. A month before his death, it was said a lion escaped from the royal hunting park, terrorizing the streets before he was killed. Another tale claimed that Babylonian priests warned Alexander that entering the city at all would bring his doom. He allegedly listened, detoured, and entered through a different gate, as if fate could be fooled by a side door. Historians still argue whether these omens were recorded after his death to make the story neater, or whether they truly spooked him. A quirky tidbit. An ancient Babylonian diary, essentially a clay tablet with astronomical notes, mentions a lunar eclipse around this time, interpreted as an ill sign for the king. Imagine having your destiny sealed not by armies or politics, but by a shadow crossing the moon. Alexander, who had once laughed at Persian magi and their rituals, reportedly took such portents more seriously in his final days. Perhaps victories had made him bold, but scars had made him cautious. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, another storm brewed, not one of omens but of politics. Alexander's marshals whispered in corners, their voices hushed but urgent. They knew he was mortal, no matter how divine his propaganda. They wondered what would happen if, when he died, his son by Roxana was not yet born. His half-brother Aridius the son, vid but suffered from cognitive impairments. Who would rule? Historians still argue whether conspiracies truly swirled around Alexander's death. Was he poisoned by jealous generals or felled by disease? The sources contradict one another, and suspicions have lingered for over 2 millennia. The actual decline began quietly. At first, Alexander suffered from fever after a banquet. The heat pressed in, wine weighed heavy, and the night was restless. He shook it off as he had shaken off countless illnesses before. His men expected him to rise the next day, shouting commands as usual, and he did, for a time. But the fever returned. He grew weaker, struggled to speak, struggled to move. Ancient sources like Arrian and Plutarch record that Alexander fell ill after heavy drinking, lingered in a fever for several days, and gradually lost the ability to speak before dying in Babylon at age 32. The palace became a hushed labyrinth. Physicians bustled in with poultices and prayers. Priests muttered incantations over sacrificial fires. Friends crowded his bedside, men like Ptolemy, Seleucus, Perdiccas, each aware that they were watching history shift beneath their feet. One story, chilling and often retold, said that as Alexander lay speechless, his soldiers were allowed to file past his bed. One by one, thousands of men entered the chamber, tears streaming, saluting their silent king. Some accounts say he raised his hand weakly to each, acknowledging them even as breath rattled in his chest. Historians still argue whether this farewell march truly happened or whether it was a later invention to dramatize the end of an era. A quirky tidbit. Alexander supposedly continued planning campaigns from his sickbed. Even as his fever consumed him, he was dictating orders about fleets and roads. Some claim he handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, a trusted general, effectively designating him regent. Others claim he gave no such order. His empire, built on iron will, cracked the moment that will flickered. The debates over his final illness remain fierce even now. Was it malaria from the marshes of Babylon, typhoid fever from contaminated water, or poison slipped into his cup by rivals? Modern scholars lean toward natural disease. Poisons of that era would not have produced such a long, drawn-out decline. But suspicion lingers because suspicion always does when great men fall young. As his voice faltered, his empire unraveled. Generals measured each other with calculating eyes. The courtiers hovered like vultures. Alexander, once the embodiment of momentum, lay still. On the 10th of June, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great died in Babylon, aged 32. In the final hours, his companions begged him to name a successor. The silence stretched, broken only by coughing, fever, and strained whispers. One tradition claimed he muttered to the strongest, leaving his empire to be claimed by whoever could seize it. Another claimed he named Perdiccas outright. Still others insisted he said nothing at all, merely drifting into death without final words. Historians still argue whether his last phrase was prophecy, command, or myth. Babylon mourned. The city that had greeted him with incense and fanfare now drowned in grief and dread. Soldiers howled in the streets. Women tore their garments. Priests beat their chests. The world had lost a king. But more than a king, it had lost an idea. The idea that one man could unite East and West under a single crown. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient writers noted that Alexander's body did not show signs of decay for several days after his death, leading many to believe he was not dead at all but sleeping, or that he was truly divine. Whether this was natural embalming, exaggeration, or sheer myth, it fed centuries of speculation that Alexander could not die like ordinary men. And so, in a palace thick with incense, sweat, and whispers, Alexander the Great, the boy who tamed Bucephalus, the man who toppled Darius, the dreamer who reached the Indus, succumbed. He was 32 years old. He had lived more lives in a decade than most dynasties live in centuries, and yet he died unfinished, with ships still half-built, campaigns unlaunched, roads untraveled. The conqueror who never lost a battle lost at last to the one enemy all men share: legacy and division of an empire. When Alexander breathed his last in Babylon, the silence that followed was almost unnatural. A man who once made the world shake with his footsteps left behind only the quiet murmur of attendants and the bitter sobbing of soldiers in shadowed corridors. He was 32, younger than many of his own generals, younger than some of his veteran sons. His eyes closed, and the empire he forged in fire, sand, and blood immediately began to unravel. For a moment, though, there was denial. The Macedonians, fiercely loyal and impossibly stubborn, refused to believe their king had died. Some insisted his body did not decay. Proof, they argued, that he was truly divine. Others whispered, he is only sleeping, that he will rise again like some Eastern god of renewal. In the palace, his officers paced and argued. What now? Who leads? Who can possibly follow Alexander? The answer, of course, was no one. Alexander died on the 10th of June, 323 BCE, in Babylon, sparking a succession crisis that tore his empire apart. On his deathbed, or so later chroniclers claimed, Alexander was asked to whom he left his empire. His answer: to the strongest. A phrase both poetic and catastrophic. Historians still argue whether he truly spoke these words, or whether they were invented later, a neat ribbon to tie around the chaos that followed. But whether or not he spoke them, his empire immediately fractured under their weight. His generals, the famed Diadochi, circled like wolves: Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, names that would soon carve kingdoms out of Alexander's corpse. Each man believed he deserved a pie, ECE, not because Alexander willed it, but because he left no clear heir. There was an heir, technically. Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife, was pregnant. Soon she gave birth to a boy, Alexander IV. Another possible heir existed, Heracles, the illegitimate son of Alexander by Barcine. But neither an infant nor an illegitimate son could command hardened veterans, and so the Diadochi manipulated, murdered, and maneuvered. A quirky tidbit. Supposedly Roxana, fierce and pragmatic, had Statira, another of Alexander's wives, murdered after his death, along with her sister Dryptis, poisoned, strangled, quietly erased. A queen removing rivals in a world where mercy is weakness. Historians still argue whether this story was factual or propaganda spread by later enemies, but it lingers as an eerie footnote to Alexander's passing. The funeral became its own battlefield. His body, embalmed in honey to preserve it, was meant to be returned to Macedonia to rest beside his ancestors. But Ptolemy, clever and ruthless, intercepted the funeral cortege. He diverted it to Egypt, where he built an opulent tomb in Alexandria. For centuries, pilgrims and emperors visited Alexander's resting place, bowing before the conqueror who lay in eternal foreign soil. Julius Caesar himself, centuries later, gazed upon his mummified body, and yet, somewhere in the folds of time, the tomb vanished. Historians still argue where Alexander's remains rest today, beneath Alexandria's streets, drowned in the harbor, or destroyed altogether. A mystery worthy of a king who lived like myth. Alexander's body was stolen by Ptolemy and entombed in Egypt, where it was venerated until late antiquity. Its final fate remains unknown. The empire he left behind fractured visibly. In the wars of the Diadochi, old comrades became bitter enemies. Battles raged from Asia Minor to India, from Egypt to Macedonia. The dream of unity crumbled. Seleucus carved out the Seleucid Empire in Persia and Mesopotamia, ruling lands once under Darius. Ptolemy cemented himself in Egypt, founding a dynasty that would culminate with Cleopatra centuries later. Antigonus and his son Demetrius struggled for dominance in Greece and Asia Minor, while Cassander clawed power in Macedonia itself. Alexander's son, Alexander IV, was eventually murdered, snuffing out the Argead dynasty in a swirl of betrayal. The Soldi, RS, once bound by the thunder of Alexander's voice, now marched under fractured banners. Some veterans returned home, scarred and weary, carrying stories of India's elephants and Babylon's feasts. Others died in wars that no longer seemed glorious, only necessary. The great engine of conquest sputtered into dozens of smaller machines. Yet, even as the empire fractured politically, culturally, it expanded. Greek language and customs flowed eastward like a flood. Cities founded by Alexander, Alexandria in Egypt, in Arachosia, in Margiana, in dozens of places most Macedonians had never heard of, became hubs of trade and scholarship. Greek art fused with Persian motifs, Indian sculpture, and Egyptian architecture. The world became Hellenistic, a blend rather than a conquest. The Hellenistic era, from 323 to 31 BCE, saw Greek culture spread across Asia and Africa, fusing with local traditions. A quirky tidbit. One of Alexander's Alexandrias was reportedly founded in modern-day Tajikistan, at a spot so remote that locals joked the city had more syllables in its name than inhabitants. Not every Alexandria became a global capital. Some were little more than fortified garrisons. Still, the idea that a man could leave dozens of cities bearing his name, like a conqueror's calling card across continents, remained staggering. In time, Alexander became more than memory. He became myth. In Egypt, he was worshipped as the son of Ammon, a pharaoh whose blood mingled with gods. In the East, Persian and later Islamic traditions wove tales of Iskandar, or Dayal-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a hero who traveled to the ends of the earth. Medieval romances painted him as a knightly adventurer, diving beneath the sea in a glass capsule, flying into the skies with a chariot of griffins. Alexander the Conqueror, Alexander the Explorer, Alexander the Immortal. Historians still argue whether Alexander should be remembered as a visionary or a tyrant. Was he a genius who sought to fuse cultures, or a megalomaniac who dragged men to their deaths chasing impossible horizons? Was he a liberator who toppled Persia's tyranny, or simply another tyrant in new clothes? The debates never end because his story resists easy answers. But here is what lingers. He changed the map forever. The borders he drew, the cities he founded, the legends he left, they ripple forward. His generals' kingdoms exist, eventually fell, but Rome rose in their shadow. The Middle East became a crossroads of cultures, languages, and faiths. Greek texts preserved in Alexandria's libraries fueled scholars in medieval Baghdad, then later re-entered Europe to ignite the Renaissance. In ways he never dreamed, Alexander became a bridge across centuries. A quirky tidbit. In the city of Kandahar, Afghanistan, archaeologists discovered coins and inscriptions linking back to Alexander's conquest. Locals still tell folk tales of Iskandar, whose army passed through long ago, as if the conqueror had only camped outside the city last summer. Myth bleeds into memory. Memory into myth. For the men who followed him, though, the legacy was simpler. Exhaustion, grief, and awe. They remembered the endless marches, the deserts that swallowed friends whole, the battles that shattered armies. They remembered his laughter in the tent, his rage when challenged, his terrifying charisma. They remembered a man who could share a cup with them one night and order their execution the next. They remembered that for better or worse, they lived in the shadow of Alexander. When modern historians sift through fragments, clay tablets, half-ruined cities, and biased chronicles, they do more than reconstruct facts. They wrestle with the same contradiction his soldiers felt. Was Alexander hero or villain? Or was he simply human, incandescent for a moment, leaving the world scorched in his wake? And yet, as the centuries stretch, the answer matters less than the story. Alexander's empire dies, but the tale lives. That, perhaps, is the true conquest. Not land, not gold, not glory, but memory. A memory that outlives walls, crowns, and dynasties. And now, with the last echoes of Alexander's life fading into the distance, let the story soften. Imagine the clamor of swords and the march of armies drifting into silence, replaced by the low hum of cicadas on a warm summer night. The dust of battle settles, and the cities he founded grow quiet, their stones cooled by evening air. Take a breath. The conqueror who raced across continents now rests, and so can you. His dreams of unity, his storms of ambition, his unrelenting drive, they are all folded away like old maps rolled tight on a forgotten shelf. What lingers for us is not the weight of his empire, but the gentler notion that even the greatest flame eventually dims, and that there is calm in that dimming. Picture the Euphrates at twilight, its waters gliding slow and silver, carrying no armies now, only moonlight. The palace halls of Babylon stand empty, shadows stretching, the laughter and quarrels gone. The world is still, as though even history itself takes a moment to breathe. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Alexander the Great, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Oliver's Stories. It truly helps me keep creating these journeys for you. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you don't mind, let me know where in the world you are watching from. I truly love reading each and every one. Thank you so much for spending your time with me tonight. Until next time, sleep well, have the sweetest dreams, and I wish you a night as peaceful as can be.